When former Disability Discrimination Commissioner Graham Innes travelled through Adelaide Airport last week with his guide dog, he knew he might encounter problems because he had so often in the past, and sadly he was right. In a statement to the ABC earlier this week, Adelaide Airport said Mr Innes' experience is not in keeping with our expected high standards of customer service, and that we have a range of policies and programs in place to assist people with disabilities. So why is it that with policies and programs in place, incidents on the ground still happen? I'd be interested in your thoughts on this too, particularly if this is something that you've experienced personally. What do you think needs to happen for widespread attitudinal change to happen in Australia so that people with disability do have full access and dignity when moving through public spaces? You can head to our Facebook page. There are many comments flooding in there. Graham Innes, former Disability Discrimination Commissioner, thank you so much for joining us today.
Great to be here, Hilary. Good to talk to you.
Glad we have you with us. And Sam Connor is with us too, President of People with Disability Australia. Sam, good to have you back on Life Matters.
Hi, Hilary. Thanks for inviting us on.
Pleasure. Now, Graham Innes, tell me about this recent experience at Adelaide Airport. What happened and how representative was it for you?
Well, Hilary, as you said, this is something that happens to me regularly. So it wasn't surprising, but it was still pretty shocking. I turned up to the security system in Adelaide Airport, happened to choose the lane with the one body scanner where you stand and hold your arms out and get scanned. Interestingly, I live on the Gold Coast or near the Gold Coast, so I use that airport. And they're the only sorts of scanners we have at the Gold Coast Airport. So I'm very used to using them, and I sit my dog down. I hold onto the lead in my left hand as I spread my arms out. I'm checked by the scanner. I don't set it off because I know what I have to take out of my pockets, etc. And I go through, my dog comes through, sets it off, and she gets patted down. That's the standard process here at the Gold Coast. And the guard at Adelaide said to me, "You're not coming through here with your dog." And I tried to explain to him that this was a regular occurrence. I knew what to do and I knew how it worked. I was talking to him and he just repeated, "You're not coming through here with your dog." And as I continued my explanation, he turned his back on me and walked away. That's a pretty insulting and offensive thing to do to a person who can't see you. And I wouldn't have known. I would have kept talking had my friend who was with me not told me that the guard had done that. After a while, it was clear that he was an immovable object, despite the fact that I explained how I could go through the scanner. So we went to the X-ray scanner. I did the same thing, went through that, sat my dog down, went through that, didn't trigger the scanner. Dog came through, triggered the scanner. So I was quite happy for her to be patted down. She's got a metal harness, so she's always going to do that. And the guard, and I'm not sure if it was the same guard or not, Hilary, it was a noisy environment, it's a bit hard for me to tell, said, "Oh, you have to be patted down anyway." And I said, no, I didn't trigger the scanner. Very happy for you to pat me down if I trigger the scanner. And he said, "No, you have to be patted down." And luckily my friend waved over the supervisor, which of course I wouldn't have been able to do, and the supervisor had not come over, and said to him, I watched my friend go through. He didn't trigger the scanner. And the supervisor, Andrew, said to the guard, "Did he trigger the scanner?" I have to say, Hilary, my sense is if I'd been there on my own, the guard would have said yes, so that he got his way and enforced the pat down. But my friend looked at him at that time and sort of sent the message very clearly, I think, "I was watching, I know what happened." And the guard said, "No, he didn't trigger." And Andrew, the supervisor, said, "Well, then he hasn't got to be patted down, just the dog," which is what I was expecting. So it's a pretty humiliating, pretty offensive. And because this has happened to me before, it's quite triggering for me. I was actually assaulted in Darwin Airport about 4 years ago by a security guard who physically pushed me backwards, put his hand on my chest and pushed me backwards. And if I didn't have good balance, I would have fallen over. So every time I go through an airport now, I feel sick in the stomach. And this, of course, just exacerbated that. My heart rate went up. I can tell that because, I have a watch that records it. I was hot. I was perspiring. I was pretty upset.
Yeah, and obviously, the supervisor knows the correct procedure, but there's been a breakdown at some other level. Adelaide Airport has said it's investigating. Have you heard anything about that from them, Graham?
I haven't heard anything from Adelaide Airport, not a thing. I've heard that they're investigating, but I'm not interested in an apology, Hillary. We have had, over the last 20 or 30 years, many apologies as people with disabilities. They're just meaningless platitudes. I want law change and I want culture change, and that has to come from the top of organisations.
And we're going to talk in some detail. This is really interesting to me about how you make that cultural change, what kind of structures and attitudes need to come into play. We're speaking with Graham Innes, former Disability Discrimination Commissioner, and with us too is Sam Connor, President of People with Disability Australia. And your text starting to come in too. People are saying we need education. People saying we need real and effective penalties. We'll nut that out in a moment. But Graham, many airlines also have this policy that limits the number of wheelchair users they can have on any given flight. What's behind those sorts of rules? How have they come to be standard practice?
Well, they're standard practice because of a very narrow interpretation of Disability Discrimination Act and standards, which sadly the federal court confirmed a few years ago. But again, they're pretty offensive practices. I mean, if you said, Hillary, that only 2 mothers with babies could go on one aircraft, then the women and parents generally would be outraged and in the streets. Yet we prevent more than 2 people with disabilities going on the same aircraft, and the infrastructure around a person using a wheelchair is probably no more complex than that around a parent with a pram and a baby. And it's just someone's made a rule in one of the airlines and decided to follow it through, and sadly the federal court has lined up behind them. That's one of the laws we need changed.
Sam Connor, you've encountered this recently, trying to make a travel booking, a group booking, for including some wheelchair users. How did the airlines respond in that incident?
I have. So I rang both Jetstar and Virgin. So the same thing remains as it was in 2012 when that case that Graham is talking about happened. There's a 2 wheelchair limit for Jetstar and there's a 4 wheelchair limit for Virgin. So my experience was a very difficult communication pathway where the person really didn't understand that I wanted to make a group booking for a number of people with, who were using wheelchairs. And then, despite explaining the reasons why we needed to travel in a group, there just was no, this is the policy and this is what we're going to stand by. It's really not good enough.
So, Sam, if we broaden it out, because you've had a lot of experience dealing with issues of accessibility and respect and dignity, if we look at, say, workplaces or accessing services, what are the issues that come up most often for people with disability in relation to that gap between policies and attitudes on the ground?
Oh, there's so many. It really depends on the type of experience, So Graham was part of the airline working group for a while and I think threw up his hands in despair. So I'm a wheelchair user. For me, as a manual wheelchair user, it's different to being a power wheelchair user. We're already inconvenienced in that we have to turn up an hour before, or 3 hours in some cases. We're travelling to New York in a couple of weeks. And I think somebody said we need to be there 5 or 6 hours beforehand. And I thought, gosh, it's not going to be a morning flight, that's for sure. So there's a number of issues. A lot of them are just about respect and dignity, but also understanding people with disabilities. So, for example, there's a rule that says that you must be read the safety announcements, even if there's, I fly a lot. And when I'm flying, even if the stewardess has seen me the day before, we're boarded first and we have to have a special talk. Do up your seatbelt low and tight. Even if you say, you just saw me yesterday, I don't need an additional talk, they still do it because it's, that's the rules. There's issues around our wheelchairs being broken and left behind. There's issues around the way that we board. Often we need to use this cherry picker type device with massively loud beeping, which is really uncomfortable and difficult. So there's a raft of issues for people with a range of different disability.
And Graham, I know you've talked before about the fact that they built these ramps for other people not in wheelchairs and they didn't make them big enough for people in wheelchairs. And so that's why you have to use the cherry picker.
strong enough and too steep. These are ramps at airports that don't have aerobridges, and I just think it's absolutely outrageous that someone could actually, as one of my friends who uses a wheelchair said, it's a goddamn ramp. That's what ramps are all about, and that's just typical of the way people with disabilities are treated. The airlines and airports have thumbed their noses at the Disability Act for the last 30 years, and we have to change that. And really the problem, I think, is that what airlines have done, and other transport systems have not done this, airlines have built a separate system for people with disabilities. And if they just made the existing system accessible for everyone, we wouldn't have a second-class system. We'd have a system which everyone can use, a more accessible system. And I think that's the crux to this whole problem.
Well, let's look at some of the ideas that get floated about how to change this situation. Education, for example, staff being retrained. Sam Connor, does that give you comfort, the idea that, we'll have a retraining session for staff? Is that likely to be done right?
Oh, look, I think they're worse when they do their own training, actually. Sometimes I find that there's these people who are, I've just been trained on this and blah, blah, blah. I think the only time that training works in organisations around this is when they're trained by people with disability themselves, so they have a real understanding of what this looks like for us. And I think the impact when people with disability relay these stories is, I don't know if you can tell the difference with Graham's voice just then. When he's relaying that story of this horrendous experience at the airport, he sounded really traumatised. And then when he's talking about advocacy and systemic stuff, he's quite confident and whatever. Sorry, Graham, throw you under the bus there. But under the plane, sorry. And so there's actually an emotional impact that comes with this, I think the difference is that when people understand the cumulative impact of being discriminated against every single time we catch a flight, that's when the cultural change happens, as well as the other changes.
And Graham Innes, you've argued that part of that is having more people with disability involved in constructing the training and delivering the training that undertakes that education about needs and attitudes, but also having people, more people with disability employed in organisations across the board. But I found it really interesting, that story we saw on the 7:30 program last week about allegations of discrimination from staff at the NDIA, the National Disability Insurance Agency. They've got a target of 15% of staff with disability. They've got 19% employed, and yet they're still having problems. Is that all it takes, representation?
No, it's not all it takes. And training is necessary, of course, but I don't think training is the answer here. But any training, of course, people with disabilities have to be central in the development of the training and in the delivery of the training. No question about that. But this needs law change. This needs laws which require airlines to do certain things, rather than this friendly, we'll talk to our mate about that in the airline or in the airports corporation and see if we can sort that out. So we need to bring that to an end. We need to have the rules clearly set out. But it also needs cultural change. And airlines and airports, if they're serious about treating people with disabilities not as second-class citizens, need to employ people with disabilities in senior roles, and senior managers need to commit to this stuff, because whatever they don't, the existing negative and limiting attitude of the general community towards people with disabilities will flow through to airports and airport staff. And Sam, you didn't throw me under the plane at all. That's a really insightful observation. I think you're right. I am actually worried about the next time I go to an airport. I will do it, of course. I'm not going to stop, but I am worried about it. And I'm worried that my independence will be taken away because I won't be able to go through security without having someone with me to provide me with support. That would be outrageous.
Yeah, there's lots of comments coming through on our text line and on Facebook. Linda says, yep, I've seen it. Often it's people, in her experience, with dementia or learning and mental disabilities who seem to cop a lot of bad treatment. She says a disability is more socially accepted when it's a disability that can be seen. People are too quick to judge and are in too much of a hurry to slow down to accommodate other people. Interesting, Graham, to think about the legal situation. I mean, we've had the anti-discrimination laws for a long time. We've got the Disability Discrimination Act 1992. We've got the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We ratified that in 2008. There's a set of disability standards, federal set of standards for accessible public transport, and they apply to aviation. They date from 2002. How are the airlines getting away with, as you say, thumbing their noses at those regulations?
Because the power balance is so wrong. So whenever something like this occurs, the person who is discriminated against has to lodge a complaint. They have to get in a queue, wait for 12 months now to have that complaint dealt with because the Human Rights Commission is so under-resourced, and then they go into court against a bunch of lawyers in suits. Often they're there on their own or with one advocate who may not be legally qualified, and then they run the risk, if they pursue the matter in court, of losing their house because it's a cost jurisdiction. The system is way out of whack in terms of the balance of power for people with disabilities, and that's why airlines know they can get away with this, and that's why they do it. Airlines and airports know they can get away with it, so they just ignore what should be their responsibilities under that legislation and that international commitment that Australia has made.
Sam Connor, from your perspective as President of People with Disability Australia, what are your thoughts on how we fill that gap between the talk and the walk when it comes to people with disabilities' experiences of access and accessibility and dignity? We've got lots of people on our Facebook page saying we just need to start educating children from kinder on. Is that part of the puzzle for you?
I think so. I think, we can tell when people have a disabled person in their family. They're weirdly normal with us.
Weirdly normal.
They're weirdly normal. I was on the drum one day and Ellen Fanning casually, motioned to this power cord on the floor and said, mind your step. And I said, oh, do you have a disabled person in your family? And she said, oh, my dad was a quadriplegic. Why? And so it's a thing where we can actually tell because people are awkward around disability because we're segregated and isolated and, not in the world. So if you look at the where our Vice President lives, Kelly Cox is in Ballina, Jetstar, dominates the capacity to Sydney. And so out of 540 seats in 3 flights, only 6 are available to wheelchair users. So people don't see us on planes there. People don't see us in schools. People don't have an understanding of what we need and what our lives look like and what our disabilities look like because they're not really alongside of us. So, it's a really important issue.
Yeah, indeed. Graham,
I was just going to say, we get put in segregated schools, we get put in segregated workplaces. How can you expect anything different?
Graham, I'm interested to see that you are involved with something called the Attitude Foundation, and that's about changing attitudes. How does it go about that?
Well, I helped start that when I left the Human Rights Commission because I realised that the biggest barrier that people with disabilities face is the attitude barrier. And we use television and social media to have people with disabilities tell our own stories about doing work, about doing community activities, just about doing life. And because we know we need to change this trope of people with disabilities either being heroes, our Paralympians are heroes and inspiring and amazing, or about being victims. The person is in an accident and the negative impact that will have on their lives. Because what we are is actually just ordinary people, and we want to be agents of our own destiny and get on with our lives.
Yes, indeed. And Graham, can you point to examples where good work is being done in companies or organisations? You're involved with a lot of boards.
Yeah, there are bits of good work being done in many organisations. There aren't too many organisations, I'd be interested in Sam's comment, that are getting it all right, but there are some that are really working hard at it. I sit on the board of one organisation where 38% of the employees are people with disabilities, and that is an amazing organisation because the workforce just gets disability, and so our clients are also people with disabilities, and there's outstanding passion and energy to change society for people with disabilities as a result.
Yep, weirdly normal with people. I love that phrase.
Yeah, it's a great phrase.
Thank you both so much for joining us today. I'm sorry we had to talk about this stuff, but I'm also glad we're able to bring it to a wider audience. Thanks for your time.
Thanks so
for
much,
the opportunity, Hilary.
Sam Connors, President of People with Disability Australia, and Graham Innes is former Disability Discrimination Commissioner. And I'd like to leave you with this text from Marg. She says, I'm constantly treated poorly going through airport security. I've had 2 hip replacements. I've had to endure body search, including a hand down the pants in view of all. That is outrageous. This is Life Matters. And up next, is the pursuit of pleasure, pure sensory enjoyment, a luxury, or is it a radical act that could shake the foundations of late capitalism? As always, I will let you be the judge here on RN.
ABC RN helps you understand the world. Find more of our stories on the ABC Listen app.